a world premiere video from P Squared. That's the Parte Passe. Woo! Yeah! All right! Rock! Woo!
Oh, say can you rock?
Sitting down to draft a brand new cube. Hope I don't scrub out like a total noob. Maybe I'll start with a signpost gold card, and then perhaps it won't be so hard. Skråden om ett kip, skråden om ett kip, skråden om ett kip.
Okay.
Ready to go now?
Yes.
Great. I just cleaned some of them, but it didn't last very long. Anyway, welcome to a brand new episode of Lucky Paper Radio. My name is Andy. I am here as always with my co-host, Anthony, fresh off his top 8 at Steel City Cube Maddox.
I don't know what I'm more surprised by, your very cool NPR-style tone or your very optimistic called shot.
Yeah, I figure it was my turn last time. It's probably your turn this time.
Do we even have time if one of us top 8s and we stick around for it? We're getting back to Baltimore pretty late.
Well, you also top 8 is single elimination, so you'd have to top 8 and then also do really well
if I'm
in the top 8.
If I'm gonna top 8, I'm gonna commit to the bit. Come on.
I mean, I didn't just congratulate you on your winning of the event, so bold of you to make assumptions. But yeah, I mean, we'll stick around if someone top 8s. Yeah. I also, like, my cube is going to be there for that time block as well, but then also Greg is going to be in Baltimore the week after. We'll figure it out. It's kind of a long drive. My original goal...
Wow, we get back-to-back Greg weeks? This is great.
I know, it's a big season of Greg. My original goal was not to drive too much after dark. Like, I think that's a very reasonable rule to set for yourself. But, you know, it gets dark at like 8:30 now, so yeah. If we top 8 and make it all the way to the finals of that draft, then yeah, it'll be late by the time we get home.
Anyway, that was great. Thanks for hosting that event, Greg.
We love Steel City Cube. Let's hope no disasters happen there. That would make this very awkward. No, we're pre-recording this. We haven't gone to Steel City Cube yet, but this episode will come out one day after we arrive back from the event. Hope it was great. On this episode, Anthony, I want to talk about some comments on our previous episode by listener and member of the MTG Cube Talk Discord, Crimson Yoshi, who had some thoughts about our comments surrounding old Border Magic maybe being simpler than new Border Magic. We've talked a lot about complexity in the show. It's an oft-mentioned topic, and they had an interesting perspective here, which is a nuanced take that I had not exactly heard before. I felt like I learned some things from Crimson Yoshi's comments that I think it's worth talking about. Before we do that, I messed up. I'm not a great podcast producer. You know, I feel like I'm okay on the show. At least I get it out every week, but I forget things sometimes. And so much time elapsed between us putting out the Modern Horizons 3 survey and us actually producing the episode that I forgot we got a singular hot take, which I do want to play now.
Hey, it's me, beloved Riptide Lab poster, GayTransMulldrifter. Here is a short rant on why I think energy is boring. It's because energy doesn't do anything. So, like, when you think about some of the most popular themes to build around in cubes, right? Stuff like graveyard matters, spells matter, 1/1 counters matter. These are all things that have an inherent function within the game engine, right? We love to do shenanigans with the graveyard because a card being in the graveyard, means something within the context of how Magic works. It's a resource that has been used up, and then you get to use it again somehow. Pretty cool stuff. Even something like 1/1 counters, which is a theme that some people dismiss as being, too prescriptive, that has an inherent meaning, right? They make your guys bigger. Your guys get bigger, and then they hit the other guy for more damage. Incredible. Energy doesn't work like this. Having an energy counter does not do anything for you outside of the context of cards that tell you that you can spend energy counters on them. They are the definition of just you have a game object. You have a resource, put tab A into slot B kind of design. And this also means that almost all of the most viable energy cards for Cube are just self-fueling designs that give you energy and then immediately have you spend that energy on themselves. The new energy lightning bolt card, Galvanic Discharge or whatever, it's literally just a card that gives you 3 energy and then immediately asks you to spend all of that energy on itself, which is not particularly interesting. And that's how it's going to play out in 99% of scenarios unless you fill up just an entire portion of your cube with other energy cards. Like, if energy gave you some kind of inherent bonus, right? Like, you could spend it on cards for powerful effects, but also, like, it did something else. It might have a more interesting push and pull. Oh, do I want to spend my energy on this card, or do I want to keep my energy counters because they do something for me? That's just, like, not a thing. It's, as it stands, it's just not surprising to me that so many people are just saying things like, I will not allow any of those ugly symbols anywhere near my cube. Anyway, free Palestine.
I think that's a great point and actually connects to a lot of I think what we'll probably end up talking about with complexity. I actually thought it was really interesting that Modern Horizons actually had not 1, but 2 of what you might call, well, there's slightly different takes on it, but kind of like marker mechanics that don't do anything inherently on themselves between energy and devoid, which, same thing happened when devoid was first printed, that many people reacted negatively to it because they were just like, why does this matter? This card doesn't do anything differently because it is colorless. It's only because other cards care about it. I mean, we could even talk about the Eldrazi, what were they called? The processors and the ingesters. Yeah, that was it. So it's like, why do I care about exiling these cards? Well, there's this like component B that you can then care about it later. And I'm kind of surprised to see them do a whole bunch of these at once. I'm also not that surprised because, Modern Horizons is a set that's designed for a much more enfranchised player. So my sort of feeling about that is that they thought they had a lot of leeway to kind of do these more involved things that kind of take a sort of second level of understanding to really get what the mechanics are about. So it makes sense that we saw a bunch of those kinds of things kind of packed all into one set together to me. I do maybe want to give a little bit of credit to energy because, like, the game is built around resources. Like, mana, also, you could make the same argument. It's just not that interesting because mana doesn't do anything on its own. It's
but if it stays there until the end of turn, it does damage to you.
Oh, right. I forget about that. That's a really important part of mana. So I think that this is a thing that comes up in a lot of games where people have a tendency, especially sort of like newer game designers, just to add more resources, just be like, oh, well, we want to have like another axis of things you can do and actions you can take, so let's add more resources to this game. And, whenever I talk to game designers, that's the thing they most emphasize is like, pare it down to the simplest thing. Like, what is the resource that actually makes the core mechanics of your game work, rather than piling in more things before you see that they're necessary. Wizards of the Coast is not a bunch of novice designers. They know a lot and have a lot of experience designing games, and the fact that energy gives them this extra access for cards to care about each other and say, like, well, my second Galvanic Blast is only going to be a gut shot, but third one now I'm going to be able to use that stockpiled energy to do a whole bunch of damage to something. It does lead up to, like, interesting decision space. It's just that, I totally agree that a single card that cares about energy in that way is just not really going to function in an interesting way more than a lightning bolt would in a cube environment that otherwise doesn't care about that.
Yeah, I have decks designed for teaching people how to play Magic, and I do it somewhat frequently, as much as I get a chance. If anybody ever wants to play Magic, I always jump at the opportunity to teach them. I did this recently, and, it's... You come to take some things for granted playing Magic a whole bunch, that it's very easy for new players to not understand. And one of those things is that, like, the graveyard is not expended at all. Like, there's so many cards in Magic's history that take advantage of the graveyard as a resource, because I think the Magic designers over time have latched on to the same thing that GayTransMulldrifter mentions here, which is that that's a thing that already exists. Like, anything it's like they looked around the room and anything that was there, that became a resource, right? Because that is just a compelling way to make a game design rather than just continually inventing new resources like energy, because they fall prey to this kind of criticism very reasonably. I still stand by the thrust of my original argument, which is that, like, if energy had been designed in 1998 and we'd be getting energy cards for a zillion years, I think that would make the mechanic...
It would feel totally different in the same way that, a card in the graveyard, if you just say, like, before the game, mill 10, that doesn't really do anything to the game if, you're just assuming, like, that could have just as easily been the bottom 10 cards of your library. Like, unless you have a bunch of tutors, that doesn't really matter. But because so many cards care about the graveyard, it kind of gets... imbued with this aura that we all have this sense of importance to it, which is important. And I think it's the same thing that if there just were a ton of cards that cared about energy, if players were used to thinking in those lines and being like, oh, well, here's the thing that makes energy. What are all the ways that this fits into the web of cards that care about energy? And there just isn't that, because it's such a sort of, I mean, it is literally what Mark Rosewater would term a parasitic mechanic, because it just functions within that one original set that it worked within. I know that word gets used in lots of different ways, but I think that if we're talking about Mark Rosewater's initial definition of that term he invented, that's really exactly what it is.
Yeah, like if you went back to Homelands and introduced a card like Grizzly Salvage, you'd be like, this card does nothing. Well, who cares that I'm milling cards as part of the resolution of this effect? This is just like it draws a creature spell, right? But obviously, in Modern Magic, there's a zillion cards to take advantage of that resource. So I think that the mechanic, there's nothing wrong with the mechanic inherently. Like, having another resource is not inherently bad per se. It's just purely that most cubes don't have support for that mechanic. And so, yeah, I think there's a big aesthetic pushback to running just a couple cards with a brand new resource that other cards don't care about for obvious reasons. But the thing I think is important to mention here is that I think it'd be very easy for, as support increases over time, let's say the next time we go back and get another energy set, right? People are still not going to have any energy cards in their cube, and now there's going to be 3 or 4 sets worth of energy cards you could potentially pull from. Eventually, there's enough of a pool there that you will have to like go back and reassess a bunch of things you had previously ruled out for not having enough context in the broader game of Magic to actually see if, is there enough context now for me to run these 12, 15 cards that I feel like do support my goals and now make this resource not just stranded on this one card.
Yeah, I mean, I think another marker mechanic we could look at that like exactly fit that pattern was snow, where, you know, a lot of cards, it might have the snow type that doesn't have any inherent meaning unless other cards care about it. And when Call Time was released, we had a huge group of people, especially submitting
also
to
Modern
our
Horizons
survey.
1 too.
And Modern Horizons 1, absolutely. Saying, you know, they were willing to give it a try, and they were looking back at all these previous snow cards and, you know, filling their basic box with snow basics just to make a couple cards they found really compelling work. And I wouldn't be surprised if a future return to energy could have the same impact and force people to go re-look back at a bunch of previous cards that just didn't make sense initially.
Anyway, still an A+ rant. Thank you for sending it in, GayTransMulldrifter. I couldn't let it go unpublished, even though I messed up and forgot about it for the actual community set review episode. So I hope you didn't listen and think, oh no, Andy must have hated my hot take, because I loved your hot take.
It was a great take.
I just totally spaced on it because I am a subpar podcast producer. Let's read some comments from Crimson Yoshi. Did you follow this conversation? I can never tell how much you do or don't pay attention to the conversation.
50-50, and then the
Discord.
Conversation latched on to birds, and then I got a little bit more engaged.
I was about to say, you were really, I'm sure, excited to listen to the extensive conversation of the bird pack one, pick one.
Turns out a lot of Magic Cube players are really into corvids. I would not have expected that.
Yeah,
But we got some Waxwing lovers out there. Shout out to my Waxwing buddies.
There was a lot of conversation here. I'm not going to read, obviously, all of Crimson Yoshi's messages. I'll do my best to summarize things as best I can, but I'm conscious of putting words in anyone else's mouth, so I encourage anybody that is not a member of the MTG Cube Talk Discord, which is not actually affiliated with the show in any way, it's just a separate Discord that we're both somewhat active in. You can go join over there and read this conversation for yourself, or partake in another conversation of your own starting if you want. It's a great place, good moderation, good users. I'll read at least the first message here, and then I'll try and paraphrase as best I can what I believe to be Crimson Yoshi's point. Quote, I don't know how much I buy the idea of Old Border Magic being more grokkable. Certainly the rules text of individual cards is often more intelligible, but at least in the paper cubes that I've played that focus on older feeling designs, I found the draft often feels directionless because of the lack of clear signposts and information about what's possible in the environment, something which Wizards of the Coast has worked hard to improve and streamline in contemporary design, and the meta-contextual grokkability of what strategies a card contributes to and why you want to take it high is impenetrable. Does that make sense? Have other people experienced this? It's amusing you specifically mentioned Machine Schooling's 2007 Nostalgia Cube, which is the one I couldn't remember the name of, because I played that cube at CubeCon 2023, and it was the only draft at the event that I didn't have a good time with. When I reflected on it in my post-CubeCon write-up, I realized it had nothing to do with the design of the cube and everything to do with me failing to engage with the environment the way the designer wanted me to. You have to do background research and read the card list before you play that cube, or you will have a bad time, and I just wasn't accustomed to having to do that. Every card in a cube feels like it has its secrets. There's what the card says and what the card does, and what the card does is not clear from what the card says, whereas I feel like most of the time contemporary Magic cards have no secrets. What they say and do are the same. Everything you need to know about why you want the card is written on the card. I want to start here. I remember when we first got into Cube, you had a similar observation that a lot of the cards don't actually do what they say they do in a like meta sense. I know the thing you've cited before is like Splinter Twin. You're like, okay, well, if you don't know about this combo, this card actually says pair me with one other card and win the game, not make a copy of a creature. You're not looking to find cool creatures to copy. You're just looking to actually find Deceiver Exarch or Pestermite or whatever.
Right, or you're out there like, oh, Wild Mongrel, this card's great. I love to be able to have a combat trick on my creature all the time, and then your opponent entombs Gristlebrand with it, and that's not what you expected to happen.
So say more about this effect and your thoughts on it, I guess, now. We haven't talked about this in a long time, but what are your feelings as of right now around cards having like an invisible layer that you have to learn in the context of that cube?
Yeah, I mean, it's so difficult to sort of tease apart my own kind of feelings about it because as we've played a lot more, I also feel like I'm just familiar with a lot more of the cards and more willing to try some of these more like combo-y style decks. But I think overall my impression is still like the way that I enjoy engaging with Magic is in kind of a looser, fresher way. I don't necessarily want to do a bunch of homework before a draft. I like having the opportunity to just be able to show up and explore the space and have that be kind of like that is the experience of sitting down to draft. Even still, occasionally we find cubes that I play and I'm just like, oh, I really didn't get it. I did not understand the assignment, and I would have had a lot more fun had I done some homework. I mean, in like maybe a very literal sense, talk about something like Zach Barish's Cascade Cube. That really takes a lot of understanding to feel like you've understood the assignment and drafted a deck that makes sense. And it's really easy in those environments just to, I think, have a similar experience to Crimson Yoshi, where it's just like, well, my deck didn't just it wasn't just a lower performer. It wasn't just like, oh yeah, I had not my best deck. It's like my deck did not function at all. I did not feel like I was playing on the same axis as my opponents. And yeah, I mean, I think about that for myself. I think about that for, we're fortunate to now have multiple pods fire usually at our cube night. So we have the opportunity to do a little bit of self-selection. But it's also something I still think about a lot in terms of my own cube design, because especially for my main cube, regular cube, a big part of that design is to be accessible to newer players because we have people coming in from all kinds of backgrounds. And that's really something I don't want people to come out of is thinking, oh, well, I just didn't get the assignment here.
Yeah. I also don't want to design cubes that foster that feeling. But I do think that kind of depth is a lot of what provides replayability and especially interest like draft to draft in a specific cube. I mean, really what Crimson Yoshi is talking about, these secrets, are unfolding strategic complexity, specifically as it pertains to drafting and deck construction. Obviously, strategy and gameplay is a whole different question, but in terms of what cards am I taking for my deck, how am I drafting a successful deck, there's a lot of strategic complexity and depth in how do I combine these cards in ways to make them way better than they are on their face. And I like that as a part of a cube, and I know you do too, because you've also talked about how strategic depth, that kind of depth where I can read a card and understand it perfectly, and you can also show me that card alongside a couple other cards and I could get it, right? You could show a new player Wild Mongrel and then Grizzlebrand and Reanimate, and like they would get it, right? It's not like they wouldn't understand how these cards relate to each other, but each of those individual pieces.
Wild Mongrel, and 2 cards I can discard to Wild Mongrel to make it a 4/4, obviously, and whatever color I want.
But that kind of complexity where the individual pieces are simple, but they can be combined in complicated ways, is one of the kinds of complexity I hold most dear and most strive for, I think, in most of my cube designs. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, definitely. And I also think there's obviously a huge spectrum here. Like, we're talking a lot about your neoclassical cube, and in that environment there are cards and decks that just need that depth to literally do anything. So if I'm just sitting down and saying, like, I think you brought up the example of Fast Bond and just thinking, oh, I'm going to use this Fast Bond to ramp out my creatures a little bit faster, that's not really going to work. And you're going to sit down instead against an opponent who's going to play Fast Bond and then cast a bunch of wheels, and then...
Well, if you both have Fast Bond, something got weird.
Something, this is over a series of drafts. So you can just end up with decks that are literally non-functional, whereas compare that with the way I've approached the regular cube, I've still tried to have that strategic depth embedded in there, but it's just not to the same degree where it's like, okay, my deck is always still going to be trying to curve out and play creatures and have interaction. It's just sometimes you might have, Legolas and ways to do divided burn spells, or the old combo that used to be in it forever was White Mane Lion and Oketcher's Monument, 2 cards that were both okay on their own, but got pretty good when you combine them together. And so there just was a narrower band of sort of the outcome of quality of your deck, which I think is in a lot of ways a little bit friendlier to especially newer players. And it's a little bit hard to disentangle those two things, where it's like, can you still have the sort of like high highs of those extremes of like, I've built this crazy deck that does something that is totally novel and you wouldn't see, you just can't have that fast bond deck in regular Cube. Every game is still going to be some degree of just curving out with creatures. So I don't know. I feel like there is just a tension between these things, and ultimately my answer is going to be, you can't have everything all the time. It's good to have multiple cubes because we can just, pick and choose and have different experiences different times, and that's pretty valuable.
I think your point about the range of what's possible, like how high are the highs, how low are the lows, is an important parallel consideration.
Yeah.
Because you do have, I think, a lot of this unfolding strategic depth in the regular cube. But even when you get the high highs, it's still like, okay, you made an ability to make a 1/1 token for a mana, which is quite good in that environment, but also disruptible by any disenchant, any creature removal. Like, you can get in the way of that. And there also are strategies that can just go over top of it, right? Like, your opponent could just have a couple flyers, and you could still be dead the next turn, no matter how many tokens you can make. So it's not like it's unbeatable. Whereas neither of us have any cubes with Splinter Twin or whatever, or one of these other like sort of secret combos. But yeah, a really good fast bond deck that, a player takes fast bond early and then knows to take wheels and bounce lands, and, understands that, Time Spiral is a fast bond card, which showing a new player those two side by side, they might not as immediately get the value there. I mean,
sure. Or I think a great example in your Neoclassical Cube is Mind Over Matter with Arcanus and Mana Positive artifacts and things like that. These are these tools that can build this deck that's just really, really crazy and does something, operates on its own little axis, but if you don't know how those pieces work together, you're just not going to be able to draft it.
I think Mind Over Matter and a creature with a really good tap ability, I think that is kind of obvious, especially
not
Arcanus.
To me.
I mean, if I showed you those two cards, you would understand what they did physically.
Sure, yeah.
Whether or not you could draft a shell around them that functioned. A better example in that exact same vein is like Mind Over Matter with something like a Tolarian Academy. It's like, okay, how do these relate to each other? It's like, well, you really want to have lands that tap for more than 1 mana with Mind Over Matter. You want to be able to get to 4 blue with Mind Over Matter. And so this actually slots really nicely into a deck that has a lot of artifacts and is otherwise, just building up resources, because then you can turn all those resources into a Mind Over Matter and then make a bunch of mana, kind of even in a fair way. Even if you're not going infinite with Arcanus, you can just draw a couple cards with Deep Analysis and then make 16 mana and do something crazy with it.
But even in that context, like, you are not showing your players, here are 3 cards, build a combo deck. You're saying, here's, 15 cards you're looking at a time, and you have to, find and notice those patterns. And, as players, we inherently have to kind of shortcut things and condense things in order to understand them, because there's just too much information in a draft. I mean, we're talking about complexity. That's the thing. There's just more information than you can really grok. So I might look at Mind Over Matter and say, like, okay, this is a card that lets me give my creature vigilance. How is that worth this in this deck? Probably not, and just skip it.
That ain't worth
and not make the connection to, oh wait, this can actually untap lands, and oh, there are lands that tap for multiple mana, and suddenly this whole and there is a way to rebuild that card advantage to turn it into an engine. There are a lot of steps to making that idea come together when you're not looking at all of the right pieces at the same time.
Yes, it is a lot. And, the fair Mind Over Matter decks use all that mana to just cast a Brain Geyser, and then hopefully they draw enough cards that produce more mana.
That does not feel fair to me when it's happened to me.
I just mean they're not going infinite. It's not like
sure.
I just combine these 2 cards and just do it.
They just win the game outright all at once in one sort of linear step instead of an infinite step.
Yeah, I mean, you have to have you've committed a lot of picks to that deck to make that thing possible. Like, Mind Over Matter is far from dominant in this cube. I'm not even sure if it's ever actually 3-0'd. It's just a pet card of mine I think is very cool. I feel like we should at least rule the rule text of Mind Over Matter. We've talked about it enough now.
It's so short.
It's a 6 mana enchantment, 2 and 4 blue, so heavily committed to blue. It says discard a card, untap or untap target permanent, correct?
Artifact, creature, or land, specifically.
Okay, so they didn't let you untap. For some reason, a lot of the early cards that effectively are any permanent just don't refer to enchantments.
Enchantments don't really tap.
But is the whole reason it says that they don't want you to even think about tapping your enchantments?
Don't even think about it.
It seems weird that they specified that.
There's one thing that Richard Garfield did not intend. It was tapping enchantments.
Yeah, I guess. So this can do a lot of weird small things, right? You can also blank an opponent's attacker for a card every turn if you really want to, but it's best used in the ways we've described, like make a bunch of mana by untapping a thing that makes a ton of mana, whether it's a Gilded Lotus or a Tolarian Academy, draw a bunch of cards with Stroke of Genius and Brain Geyser, and then rinse and repeat until you either Brain Geyser your opponent out or use all that mana on something else that similarly wins the game. And yeah, it's extremely mechanically simple, right? Like, the rules text is so simple, so easy to grok, but how do you actually use it? It's very dense, right? Like, how to use it is a question I'm not even really prepared to fully explain right now because I'm not even sure I'm doing it correctly, but those are some ways you can abuse it. And I think it's hard for new players that have never seen any of those decks function to accept that like a 6-mana do-nothing enchantment can possibly be worth it in an environment like this, which is still ultimately quite powerful. But the fact of the matter is you can make decks that can really abuse that card. Crimson Yoshi gave a specific example here, which I thought was really pertinent. They mentioned Lash Knife Barrier as a card which has all this hidden complexity that they don't like. This is an enchantment that says when Lash Knife Barrier enters the battlefield, draw a card. If a source would deal damage to a creature you control, it deals that much damage -1 to that creature instead. Actually, quite a good card played fairly, to be honest. It's 3 mana. So 3 mana, it cantrips. If you're in a lower power environment, preventing 1 damage to every single creature on every single damage is really good. I have, playing a burn-based deck, gotten totally hosed by this before in Old Border cubes because you just can't use burn spells to kill your opponent's creatures anymore. The math does not work out for you. So it's fine, fair, but what this is often used with in some cubes is to pair it with things like Pestilence or Pyrohemia, which are 2 enchantments that allow you to, for a mana, deal a damage to every creature. I guess you could even combine it with Crypt Rats, because Crypt Rats doesn't say sacrifice it, it's a 1/1 that you can pay X and deal X damage to each creature and each player, and you always dies in the process, but it wouldn't die if you just did 1 at a time with Crypt Rats over and over again. So you have cards you can combine it with that effectively make this a piece of a combo. Now it's a way that you can just kind of lock the board out for a while by this preventing damage to your creatures and not to your opponents. And then you get to keep your creatures, so you never have to sacrifice Pestilence or Pyrohemia. It just is a nice little self-contained engine. To Crimson's point, that is not evident if you just see Lash Knife Barrier in a pack. You wouldn't expect, the best use case for this card is to combine it with Pyrohemia or Pestilence. You would just think, okay, here is a funny enchantment that prevents some damage. The card they compared it to, a modern card that has, all of the subtext is text, is Mondrak Glory Dominus. This is 2 white for a legendary creature Phyrexian Horror. If 1 or more tokens would be created under your control, twice that many of those tokens are created instead. And for 1 and 2 white Phyrexian, you can sacrifice 2 other artifacts and/or creatures to put an indestructible counter on Mondrak Glory Dominus, and it is a 4/4. Obviously, a lot more text, but Crimson's point here is that this card tells you should care about making tokens with me. You read this card and you know that obviously I should put this in a deck that can make tokens. That's very plain. You also see you can put it in a deck that has other artifacts because it cares about artifacts or perhaps things that you sacrifice for value, your Ichor Wellsprings or whatever.
It's also kind of holding your hand and saying, like, put me in a deck with a bunch of tokens, and then, there's a built-in reward for having extra tokens, which is you can sacrifice them to make this indestructible.
Yeah, and there were a couple cards in this kind of vein that Crimson mentioned where they have the kind of design I've started to associate with, like, Commander, basically, where you get cards that are both self-contained. They, like, care about X and do Y, and care about Y and do X. They, like, are a little bit self-referential, and also just have a lot of text, right? Like, that's a lot of text on Mondrak in order to make all of those things explicit. Like, it just takes more words in order to have all of the potential ways that a card could interact be more spelled out instead of these invisible things like Lash Knife Barrier with Pyrohemia. They cited this example and were like, here's an example of what I mean. Like, Lash Knife Barrier, frustrating to me because I don't know what to do with it. Mondrak, enjoyable to me because I see it and immediately understand the kinds of decks that might be supported here because it, like, tells me so much about what kind of deck it belongs in.
Yeah, I mean, a card that always stands out to me in that kind of vein of, like, having an effect that is self-fueling, but kind of split up in a way in order that you can just have other key cards interact with it, is Dulcim, Pliable Pacifist. This is one of the secret lairs. I believe this is gonna get me in trouble. Yeah, it's Street Fighter, right? Okay, cool.
I saved you.
Great. It's 2 green-white, so 4 mana for a 1/3 legendary creature, Human Monk. It has Reach. It has Teleport, which, as we all know, means Dulcim, Pliable Pacifist, has Hexproof unless he's attacking. It has whenever a creature you control with Reach attacks, untap it, and it can't be blocked by creatures with greater power this combat. And whenever, it also has Fierce Punch, which, as we all know, means whenever one or more creatures you control deal combat damage to a player, draw a card. So it's like all this stuff together where it's like, mostly you're going to, I can't even understand this card. You're going to attack, it's going to give itself hexproof, it's going to untap itself, you're going to get to draw cards, but if you just have other creatures that are dealing combat damage, you still get to draw those cards. If you have other creatures with reach, they're going to get keyed off this ability. So it's like, yes, this is telling you build a deck around these abilities, but also this one individual card will function and sort of tell this little story all by its own if you just have this one card. And that feels so different than the Slash Knife Barrier, which is just one of those components. And you don't need this one card that has 4 abilities that make up a whole plan. It's one card that is 1/4 of a plan, and you need those other cards to make it work.
That honestly reminds me of Hillary and I were watching an episode of Taskmaster last night, which we have gotten into quite deeply. And there was a task that had some instructions, and the instructions were written in a confusing way, and it basically said, like, you know, the task is over when you tell me you're finished, and, you know, you have to read these instructions to make sure that you get it. And the way it was confusing was basically it just had a bunch of negatives such that many of them offset, like, don't not forget to do this and do the opposite of that, you know, is that kind of sentence.
And then do the opposite of the following.
Then do the opposite of the following. You must, under no circumstances, not avoid not making the bell not ring.
Then do the opposite of the following. You must, under no circumstances, not avoid, not melt... Wait.
Not avoid, not make... What the... Okay, hold on.
It's going to take me ages to work out this sentence.
The task is over when you have either rung the bell or not rung the bell and said, are you serious? This is an anxiety dream.
And as I often do, in classic a man that thinks he can land a commercial airliner fashion, saw this and was
we
like...
could just call them men.
Saw this and was like, that's so easy. All you do is just count all the negatives. An odd number of negatives don't do the thing. Even number of negatives do the thing. Don't try to read the sentence and make sense of it, because it's too hard to actually read this complicated sentence and make sense of it. And all 5 of these people just couldn't do it, basically. Like, they ended up kind of just guessing because they couldn't figure it out. Well, actually, truthfully, one woman did figure it out, but then she forgot the very beginning of the sentence said, do the opposite of the following. And she ignored that one and got all the rest of them right. Anyway, it felt a little bit like reading a really complicated card. Like, the way you were just like, I'm reading Dhalsim right now, and I can't even figure out what this actually means, because it's hard to parse that much language when it is written in this very precise, structured way. And some people are better at that, right? Like, I was like, oh, this is easy. Don't read the sentence. Don't look at any of the words. Just look at the
Some
negatives.
people like you are very good at this.
I mean, I this particular thing was easy to me, but other things are not. Reading Dhalsim is not easy to me either. There are some Magic players out there for whom they read Dhalsim and it's impossibly simple. They're like, how are they confused by this? I don't get it. It's very easy to me. I think as cube designers, it's important to like recognize that everybody is going to have a different reaction to reading these cards. And my main pushback to Crimson Yoshi in this discussion, which I want to be absolutely clear, was not at all an argument. Like, Crimson Yoshi and I hold each other in high esteem. No negative feelings here whatsoever. But I felt like the kind of complexity that Crimson was advocating for is basically sacrificing a lot of strategic complexity and embracing a lot more comprehension complexity. Now you have to actually read and understand what Mondrak does, right? As opposed to looking at a pack and, like, you can parse Lash Knife Barrier very quickly. And do you know what to do with it? Maybe not, but you can parse it very quickly. It's not easy to parse Mondrak. It's much harder to parse Dhalsim because there's just a lot more words, and you have to, like, kind of go through the process and imagine, okay, I'm attacking with this now, but then it also untaps itself. Honestly, I was assuming you were going to say that card had tap ability because it has the thing that untaps itself, and it felt like there'd be something like that going on. Wizards previewed an Otter today. Honestly, I'm excited about Bloomburrow. I thought this was going to be our mechanics episode, but we're going to hold off on that a little bit. I'm excited about this set. I think there's actually a trend. I don't know if it's because of the set specifically or it's because of something stirring deep in the bowels of R&D, but have you noticed how many beautiful French vanilla creatures we've gotten already in spoiler season?
I've not.
Okay, so there are so many just very cool French vanilla creatures that I think you'll be very excited by.
There's one that's a 2/2 with first strike and lifelink.
There's also a moose. There's also a moose that's
moose.
a much better Colossal Dreadmaw. I think it's got Vigilance, Trample, and something else.
Colossal Dreadmaw was perfect.
I'm not sure if Colossal Dreadmaw was perfect. But either way, we're getting some really simple cards in a way that is very satisfying. But they also previewed this Otter today. Let me find this Otter and read it to you, because it is preposterous. This is Kitsa Otterball Elite. Legendary creature Otter Wizard. 1 and a blue for a 1/3. It's got Vigilance. It's got Prowess. It's got tap, draw a card, then discard a card. Already just an extremely pushed Merfolk
Vigilance,
Looter.
Prowess. Okay. So I'm imagining the way they built it. They had to put a tap ability. We got to give it Vigilance now, even if that doesn't like mechanically make sense. We just don't want to punish a player ever.
And also, Merfolk Looter, 2 mana 1/1, just tap draw a card. This is 2 mana 1/3, Vigilance, Prowess, tap draw a card. It also has 2 and tap, copy target instant or sorcery spell you control. You may choose new targets for the copy. Activate only if Kitsa's power is 3 or greater.
Well, how are you going to make its power bigger?
It's got Prowess.
Perfect.
Yeah. So I read this card and it was just like, they just made it do everything. Like, it's like the kind of complaints you had about White of the Reliquary, which I actually did not share. I thought White of the Reliquary was kind of cool and only felt like it had all the downsides sanded off because we had Knight of the Reliquary to compare it to. And it was like, okay, well, we can see how this one was made more flexible, and that might be a criticism. This card, it's like, it just does it all. You swing with impunity because it's got 3 toughness and vigilance and prowess. How are they ever going to block that with open mana? You just can't do it. And then you can, if they don't do anything, you can still draw and discard a card on their end step. And then if you want, you can just cast a couple spells and like copy one. Like, it just does it all in a way that's like, why am I reading all this for a card that does everything, right? Like, This is not what I love about Magic, which is a little atomic unit of mechanic, atomic unit of game piece that is then interchangeable with other atomic unit of game pieces. And I think the downside of cards like this is that
You've already drafted an entire sushi roll right here.
Whatever deck you put Kitsa in, it's kind of going to do the same thing all the time, right? Like, yeah, obviously you can compare it with discard matters cards like Madness. You can pair it with cheap instants and sorceries that you can trigger prowess. Like, it's not that it has no synergy with everything, but it's like, it's got so much going on that it's, like you said, it's a plan all in and of itself. So you don't have to pair it with anything for this to be compelling and interesting. It just does it all.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's actually really interesting that Crimson Yoshi pointed out specifically that they didn't enjoy the draft of that draft they were talking about. I mean, that just makes a lot of sense to me that maybe the gameplay could still be compelling, but how you could get to the end of the draft where you have this kind of like higher strategic complexity environment where you'll be like, I have 45 cards, a bunch of them are 5 mana do nothing, 6 mana do nothing enchantments. I've got Mind Over Matter, but I don't really have anything to do with it. It feels like my deck kind of train wrecked. And on the other hand, if we have these cards that are very much self-contained, but have even higher ceilings, because if you can, build around that prowess to be able to turbo out, copying a spell, and, doing all this powerful stuff, the ceiling there is really high, and you absolutely can still have that kind of dynamic about building around narrow cards. But the cards aren't that narrow. They will still do something, and it's much easier during the draft to say, here are my cards. I feel confident they will do something. And yeah, I mean, I think that just having that like failure case actually still look like a functional deck is going to be a lot more appealing to a lot of players, whereas maybe you have a much higher tolerance for having that failure case being like, yeah, I don't get this environment yet. This draft is kind of over, but I'll run it back and do another one.
Well, I want to talk about that outcome and like how likely or reasonable that actually is, because that hasn't been my experience with the Neoclassical Key. Before we get there, though, I just want to come to the defense a little bit of cards that do a lot of things, like to compare this otter to, for example, to Ragavan. Ragavan's a...
Compare this otter to a monkey.
Let's compare... Yeah, what a weird podcast we have. That's a 1-mana 2/1 that has this card advantage engine built in and also ramp built in. It does a lot. It also has a lot of text, probably a similar amount of text. But to me, that does not feel like it stands alone. Like, you need to... It's a 2/1. Like, yes, it only costs 1 mana. It's efficient, but you still have to be able to clear the board of any of your opponent's blockers, because anything in the world will kill or trade with Ragavan, basically.
Unless they have Lash Knife Barrier.
Unless they have Lash Knife Barrier. This is the new tech.
Or 2 Lash Knife Barriers.
Lash Knife Barrier Ragavan. It's gonna be a big thing. It's gonna take over Legacy. No, it's banned in Legacy. Not
Wait,
Lash
really?
Knife Barrier Ragavan.
Oh, that makes more sense. I was like, what is going on here?
Like, it still demands something of the deck you've constructed around it, at least. And some of these more involved cards, like, I mean, I guess to Crimson's point, Mondrak doesn't function on its own. It tells you what it does. It tells you what kind of deck it wants to be in, but you have to pair it with token makers or other, artifacts for Mondrak to do its thing. To be clear, like, we're kind of straying a little bit from Crimson's argument here to just other similar ideas. But this comprehension complexity of cards, I think, is just a different kind of complexity different players will have different tolerance for. I have a low tolerance for comprehension complexity because, I don't know, that's just how my brain works.
Yeah,
I know a lot of Magic cards, and if I see cards I don't know in a pack, I am likely to oftentimes not read them in a cube unless I have an inkling it might be worth my time. Like, I am not willing to draft a cube where I'm going to have to read every single card, because that's just not what I'm in for. Like, that draft would not be fun for me in the same way that Crimson Yoshi's describing a draft where they don't know the kinds of decks the cards belong in is not fun for them.
Right. I think it's worth also just real quick explicitly defining some of this language. These are both terms, strategic complexity and comprehension complexity, that Mark Rosewater, I think they're good descriptive terms, but he also sort of has codified them and promoted their usage. Comprehension complexity meaning, can you look at the individual card and read it and understand what it does? So a wordier card is going to be much more difficult. Or how hard is it to do that?
Not can you do it as a binary?
Yeah, and again, like that all adds up when you're looking at a pack of 15 cards you haven't seen before. It's taking a lot of effort. You're not like focusing on every card with your full attention. And strategic complexity being, how much do you have to understand, or how much complexity is there to understanding the whole system and how to build a strategy out of those many disparate pieces. And the really cool thing is that strategic complexity often is just not very visible to less experienced players, because they're just looking at the individual cards and saying, yep, this card works. You know, Mondrak, baseline, it's a 4-mana 4/4, so sure, I can put that in my deck. So it's interesting that you can actually design an environment where the individual cards are fairly simple, and a sort of new player might look at that Wild Mongoose and say, great, this is a green creature that I can get into combat with, and it's going to be cool that I have this combat trick on all the time.
Wild Mongrel?
Wild Mongrel.
Because Mongoose is also a card.
That is also a card. Wild Mongrel. But a more sophisticated player, a player with specific experience with doing a reanimator deck, is just going to see something totally different. And this is another thing that Mark Rosewater likes to call lenticular design, which, you know, if you've ever seen those little lenticular bookmarks that as you tilt them back and forth, you see different images in them. That's kind of the idea he's trying to get at, where different players will just see different things, and it might look much simpler to somebody who's looking at it the first time. And then as you get more experience, you get this more complex strategic depth, which, I mean, I think that is sort of like the end goal for a lot of game design and a lot of design in general, is to make things that look simple but actually have a lot of depth, and it's really hard to achieve that.
Yeah, and this has always been my perspective, that like I kind of thought that was almost like a universal good. Like, of course we want simple things that have this unfolding deep complexity. And this,
that's certainly my taste as well.
Yeah, and this complaint of Crimson Yoshi's that then if you really commit to that idea, especially in a cube that has a high ceiling in terms of what's possible and has cards that are more unfamiliar to some of your drafters, you run the risk of them just being like, well, I don't know what any of these cards do because I don't speak this language, this like secret language of how these cards are meant to interact, and that can be very frustrating.
Yeah, and to be fair, I think that there is still a language, a context that is relevant. You know, if you are used to playing a lot of Limited and you're looking at Mondrak, you actually have this framework of evaluating it where you're saying, well, this is a 4-mana 4/4 its baseline. All of its abilities are upside, so great. Like, I can actually simplify a lot of that complexity with those heuristics and understand this card better.
And that is one of the things we actually talked about old school Magic, was that a lot of these synergy cards now are just independently great, right? Like, if they had printed a card like Mondrak in old school Magic, it probably would have been a 4-mana 1/3 or whatever, but now it's a 4-mana 4/4 because that is a thing that has changed about Magic design. They have definitely made it harder to truly fail to draft like a synergy deck, because all your synergy pieces these days tend to be decent creatures.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's just really difficult to sort of, we can talk about these kind of like abstract ideals of different types of complexity, but when we look at them in the real world, there's all kinds of other stuff about like the way the players are familiar with different mechanics, you know, the symmetry and patterns that we can pick up on and heuristics that we can use, and then just like the individual power level of the cards, that it adds a lot of complexity to this conversation about complexity. For example, we could pretty easily, you know, imagine an environment where there are a lot of complex cards, you know, things that just are really, really wordy, take a lot of effort to understand, but then just throw in a bunch of like 2-mana 6/6s, and we could actually then shortcut a lot of complexity to be like, yeah, it doesn't matter what the text is, players can learn pretty quickly, just draft the 2-mana 6/6s and you'll win that way. So it's really hard to isolate complexity into one number, because all of these things matter in the way that actually humans interpret these cards and are able to use heuristics and things like that to interpret them.
Yeah, just to cite one more example of a card that Crimson Yoshi likes in this space, Raga Draga Gorgut's Boss is 2 red-green for a 4/4 legendary creature human boar. Once again, 4-mana 4/4.
Love a 4-mana 4/4.
Each creature you control with a mana ability gets +2/+2. Whenever a creature you control with a mana ability attacks, untap it. Whenever you cast a spell, if at least 7 mana was spent to cast it, untap target creature. It gets +7/+7 and gains trample until end of turn. So this, like Mondrak, is not a self-contained thing. It's not like Dulcim. It's not like that new Otter. It requires you to do other things, but it tells you very explicitly what to do. Put mana dorks in your deck, and then you get to attack with them as big creatures. And also, if you produce enough mana to cast something really big, then you get to make one of your mana dorks huge. It's like turns your mana dorks, which are usually not doing a lot of attacking and blocking, except in a pinch, into actual aggressive pieces too. Honestly, it's kind of like a modern interpretation of the green Kamal, which I really like for that purpose. It basically turns a lot of your mana, whether it's lands or creatures, into threats in the late game. These are the kinds of designs I've avoided, and I think the point that Crimson Yoshi is making here, that it kind of gives you a big hint, a big push in a direction of like what kind of deck to draft, is a real value, right? Like, it's nice that the card tells you what to do with it in a more explicit way. That does come at the cost of comprehension complexity, which we've talked about. If there's a bunch of wordy cards in a pack, it's going to be hard to figure out. But I think that this desire to like look at a pack and be able to project and imagine the kind of decks you could draft, even having not seen the cube, I can see the appeal of that, and I can understand how that kind of value might have been directing a lot of Magic R&D, right? Like, let's just make these things... Like, it's almost like Magic in the old days was hard to understand for new players, and then also really hard to get to a point where you like had a comprehensive and deep understanding of it. It was just kind of hard all the way through. And new Magic is still hard for new players. Like, Magic's just hard to get into for new players. And I feel like a lot of what these cards do is basically like really bring a lot of that ceiling, a lot of that like feeling of drafting a synergistic deck into a much more accessible place, where you can be on your second or third draft, or even your first draft of an environment, and see a card that's this clear, that's this much of a signpost what you're supposed to do, and just kind of take it and start taking cards that do the thing with that card, and have that experience of drafting a synergistic deck without having to do all of that additional work.
So I feel like a counterpoint to this, though, is that there are so many cards that feel like... I think Raga Draga is a perfect example of this type of design that I totally agree feels like the most commander design you can have. It's like, do X, and whenever you do X, I'm going to reward you in 3 different ways. And I agree that can be a benefit to an environment if there actually is a payoff. If there are a lot of creatures with mana abilities in this environment, I'm going to draft it and I'm going to feel successful here. I've definitely had experiences with environments that just have so many of these types of designs that are all pulling you in different directions that I feel like at the end of the draft, it's like, well, I have 6 different Raga Dragas and they're all pulling me in different directions and I didn't really get there on any of these axes. And again, drafting is hard. We could say that's the intention of the environment, is to create this like tension space where there's opportunity to failure to make your successes meaningful. On the other hand, if I'm sitting down and drafting an environment for the first time and every card is this wordy and I didn't feel like I got there, like I feel like that feels like the foil to the experience that Crimson Yoshi's describing of struggling in old school Magic, of struggling in this new paradigm.
Yeah, and we talk a lot about accessibility on this show, and frankly, I don't think the Neoclassical Cube is that accessible. I think it's probably my second least accessible cube. The Degenerate Microcube definitely takes that prize for sure.
Where do you put Ornithopters? We've actually talked about Ornithopters.
I think Ornithopters is actually pretty accessible. Like, I mean, Ornithopters is kind of like starting with an emblem almost that tells you what to do at the beginning of the draft. It's
gotta
just like,
figure out a way to make these Ornithopters hurt people.
Gotta make the Ornithopters useful somehow. And I think that is like almost like starting with a big signpost card that tells you like you're looking for these kinds of things. Also, every single creature is identical and they're very mechanically simple. So there's reasons that cube is actually more accessible. I think the Neoclassical Cube is not my most accessible for not having accurate Oracle text, for having cards like Parallax Wave, which even if once you read the entire card, like, what do you actually do with this? It's actually quite complicated. That one also has a lot of comprehension complexity. Parallax Wave is not simple. It's really complicated what it actually does. But I have been very pleasantly surprised by newer or less enfranchised players that have drafted the Neoclassical Cube and reported they had a great time and they really enjoyed themselves. Even players that all these cards were printed 4 years before they were born and they still felt like they had a really good time in their first draft. And that's because of this pattern, which happens when you design a cube in the unfolding strategic complexity way, which is that all of those things that you can say at the beginning, well, experienced players are just going to know this and that's going to be unfun for me because I won't know it. You will almost certainly over the course of a draft have a chance to discover some of those things yourself. And to be perfectly frank, there are things about the Neoclassical Cube, because I choose to run cards like this that have like an atomic unit of game mechanic that you then can, use however you want. There's lots of combinations of cards that I haven't even thought of, right? So it's not even like you're discovering it as in you're like getting caught up to everyone else. You might genuinely be discovering new ways to combine cards that have not occurred to me. That discovery, I think, is really fun. And even players, I think, that come in and go 1-2 because they didn't quite understand what was possible in the environment have reported that they had a good time because they got to do their thing once or twice, and they also got to see other things that are possible. They got to see that, you can combine Mind Over Matter with Goblin Welder and do some kind of silly stuff if you can get those two cards going. Like, that is a cool combination you can make work.
Yeah, and I do appreciate that because there is this strategic complexity of combining cards to make weird engines, but the individual cards are often relatively understandable. When my opponent does something pretty rude to me, usually I get it. And that's been a fun thing for me to do in this environment, is like somebody built a humility deck and really kicked my teeth in. And so the next time I drafted the cube, I was like, I'm definitely going to try and draft this humility deck and see if I can make it work. And my deck actually worked out like kind of not the same, but in ways that were also interesting, where it's sort of like there is this narrative of how you're engaging with it that kind of keeps evolving. That's satisfying. And that's pretty different from games of, I'm just going to say it, a lot of games of Commander where it's like, I literally do not know what's happening on the other side of the table, and I don't have time to figure it out. And
yeah, I have 6 cards that each have 200 words on them, and these are actually doing this powerful thing, and it's like, okay, I trust you. Like,
so every time I cast this,
ahead.
I get 2 of these tokens, I get 4 treasures, this gets +1/+1, I untap this, you take 2 damage, and it's like, yeah, I guess so, here we go.
Sounds bad for me.
Sorry
Good
that happened
job,
to me.
I guess.
Or congratulations.
Yeah, so, I don't know, I mean, I still am a fan of the kind of complexity that I like. I like cards that are simple, that can be combined in complicated ways, and I fully accept that might mean that it takes a little more learning to get a player up to speed where they are able to 3-0 with a new cube, right? It might mean that, yes, in the first handful of drafts of a new cube, you might be disadvantaged compared to players that do have a lot of experience in that specific environment. I think that is a cost I'm willing to pay, because Magic is a deep, complicated game, and to some degree, I do want to reward the more experienced and skilled players, and not just... There's a tension between accessibility and rewarding strategic play, where obviously some players are better and they're more knowledgeable, and if they're not winning more, then have you gone too far in the accessibility area to make this? I guess what I'm saying is I don't think accessibility means that a new player should expect to be able to sit down and just understand everything completely and, 3-0 the first time regularly, right?
Yeah,
it means that they should understand what's going on. And I like that you can read humility, and all the complicated layers aside, you understand what humility does. You understand the point of what humility is supposed to do, right? It's very simple. You understand what Mind Over Matter does mechanically. I don't have to sit there and read it for 90 seconds and then reread it to understand what Mind Over Matter does. I can get that piece pretty quickly, and if I decide that I want to try and figure out a way to make that do something in this draft, I can take it and do that, or I can ignore it, right? And yes, you may later on learn that, you actually already had Overgrowth and Fertile Ground and Frantic Search, so you were actually already on your way to a pretty good Mind Over Matter deck. You just didn't quite identify that because these cards don't seem necessarily on their face overtly connected, the same way that if you had Raga Draga, you're not passing a good Mana Dork, right? Those cards are so blatantly tied together that you're not going to miss that. I'm prepared to have people miss more things, have the cube have more secrets in exchange for depth of replayability and for the cards just being mechanically simple and the comprehension complexity being a lot lower.
Yeah, and I think we could, honestly punctuate every episode with this, or every conversation about Magic, with just the fact that setting expectations correctly is really, really important. And if somebody is sitting down to draft the Neoclassical Cube, I think you sort of set them up and say, hey, there's some broken stuff people are going to do here. Be prepared to learn from that experience when your opponent does something crazy. And when people know that can happen going in, they're not going to be as disappointed when they're not just my, curve out green creature deck didn't really get there.
Anyway, what I took away from Crimson Yoshi's comments, which, Crimson, I hope we didn't misrepresent anything that you said, and I'm sorry if you feel ganged up on just because Anthony and I have I think, a similar perspective on this complexity, which is not yours. But what I feel I learned from this is that, well, first of all, I think maybe there's room for both, right? There's no reason why you can't have a cube that is fully committed to the kind of atomic level complexity we're describing with all the unfolding strategic depth, and then also just throw a couple signpost cards in there that tell you exactly what they do on them so that a newer player, if they want, can say, well, there's Raga Draga, I know what I'm doing, I'm just going to commit to that, right? And in that way, as long as you as a cube designer have made it so that those decks are competitive with each other and reasonably within the same power level, you can have both these things accessible in the same draft, whereas maybe an experienced player is like, I'm not going to do the Ragged Dragon thing. I've done that a million times. And to be fair, I think there are some things kind of like that in the neoclassical cube, like Enchantress's Presence and Argothian Enchantress just say take enchantments, right? Like, they are much simpler versions of Ragged Draga that just says just take mana dorks. And so I think that kind of surface level complexity and strategy as text is a worthy thing that I hadn't necessarily fully grasped the value of before, because I am so enamored with this idea of the subtext being the strategic depth.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's always going to be the case with a cube, is that unlike designing a commander deck, for example, that's just one deck focused on one thing, the fact that you're creating an environment for people to do multiple things, because you don't always want to be playing the mirror match. You want to be playing different matchups. So just, I think it might be valuable to, when you're designing a cube, think about having things with different levels of visibility. I mean, I think about this a lot with the regular cube, where zombies is like the most explicit theme you could have, but that's just one of many things you can do. And you can also, do a twist on the zombie thing where you're a little bit caring about the creature type, but then you're also caring about sacrificing or something like that. So having both things that are different levels of in your face, and then also inroads to link those themes together.
Yeah, I mean, the dream for me is that discovery process, the drafters themselves having that experience, even if they're 10, 12, 15 drafts into the cube, where there are some things that are explicit, like Goblin Ringleader, take other goblins, and then, I can set it up with Goblin Recruiter, and then, I can also set it up and have the goblins I get be Goblin Welder and Goblin Engineer, and make this deck do a whole different thing than just attack with goblins, and now I have a whole, complementary engine that goes and ties everything together, and then I can take Mind Over Matter and untap my Goblin Welder, right? Like, the idea that you could kind of start connecting all of that together yourself as a player is exactly what I'm seeking the most of. And I think it's really hard to have cards where the complexity is text that you can combine in unexpected ways. Like, what's the most unexpected thing you can do with Ragged Draga or Mondrak? I mean, I'm trying to think.
I think that there are probably many unexpected things you can do, but they will not surprise me to the same degree, because I'm just already kind of, Well,
you didn't read or take Ragged Draga in the draft, so it would never surprise you.
I did not. I would be like, oh, what does that do? Okay, great.
Anyway, like I said, I hope
you could give a Dreadhorde Arcanist a mana ability, put a Paradise Mantle on it, and then it gets +2/+2.
It's really good with Cryptolith Right. I mean, Cryptolith Right plus Ragged Draga is pretty nuts.
Yeah, that's cool.
Is it unexpected? Maybe
doesn't
a little
work
bit.
It doesn't work with Earthcraft.
Doesn't work with Earthcraft, it's true. Honestly, my first thought when I saw Ragged Draga is, better not put Arbor Elf in that cube. That'd be hugely disappointing.
Oh, yeah.
Can't do it.
Oops.
Gotta cut Arbor Elf. Anyway, like I said, I hope that this felt fair to you, Crimson. If you want to read the full text of this discussion we had in the Cube Talk Discord, check it out. We'll put a link to the Discord in the show notes. As a reminder, we have a P.O. Box. We talked about the P.O. Box in the last episode, Anthony. We did not read the address. It is P.O. Box 4855, Baltimore, Maryland 21211.
You don't want to make it too easy for people. They got to do a little bit of work to find the address.
Unfolding strategic complexity of contacting us is part of our podcast ethos. Next episode is our book club for The Beauty of Games. If you have a local bookstore that has you, maybe still have a chance to go buy it right now and read it in the next 5-6 days before the episode drops.
Or most people probably read things on e-readers anyway, which makes it immediate.
God. I guess that's possible, yeah. Boy, I have no interest in that. But if that's your thing, great, good for you. It's a pretty quick read, I dare say. So get in there, and we'll talk about it next week. And then Bloomburrow sometime in the future. I'm actually still excited about this set, I will say. I think this set is very cool. I might make you read some cards about it whenever you're feeling good. But that's it for this episode of Lucky Paper Radio. All of our music is produced by DJ James Nasty. All the Magic cards are produced by Wizards of the Coast. This podcast is produced by Thinking Really Hard About Magic Cards and been speaking into microphones about it. Anthony, thank you for the gift of friendship, and thank you for the gift of Cube.
Andy, thank you for the gift of friendship and the gift of Cube.
I think you should think of something even more fun to say in response.
I didn't have time.
I know, but I'm telling you now, I'm going to commit to that outro. So you've got time. Think of some cool way to put a little cherry on top of the episode. Just, finish it strong.
I got stung by 2 hornets 2 days ago.
I wish I was there for that. I mean, I'm sorry it happened to you.
You want to imagine me sprinting through my kitchen, tearing my apron and towel off and shrieking?
Something I always think whenever I hurt myself is I'm like, well, I wish I had a video of that. Because,
I do not want
I already got hurt. So, if that was going to happen regardless, I wish I could have seen it. And in the same way that obviously I don't wish that you got stung by a hornet. I wish I could have been there to see it, given that it did happen.
It wasn't fun, and I haven't been stung by a lot of things, so I was like, it's hurting worse. Pain's getting worse. When does this turn around? Turned out in the end, not that bad, but
that was like when I stepped in that stingray. That sting was definitely like, at first I was like, oh, it's like I got poked by a knife in the foot. And then I was like, this is hurting more. And it just kept hurting more for like an hour. And I was like, uh-oh, not good.
Anyway, hope those hornets are out there living their best life.
They're not, well, the ones that die after they sting somebody, that's just bees.
That's just bees, yeah.
I say disarm the hornets. Defund the hornets. They shouldn't be having...
What are they going to have left?
They shouldn't have impunity with their little stingers.
It's still risky. That's why they came at me from both sides. Bam, bam.
Yeah, you didn't kill either of them?
No, I ran away screaming like a little bitch.
Skrada now.